All right, thank you, everybody. We will call to order a meeting of the Commission on Connecticut's Development in Future. I see a number of members of the commission are online, and we have some folks here in the room. Do we usually take attendance of these?
Just usually make sure the clerk's got it all.
Clerk's good. I'm getting the thumbs up from the clerk. So great. So we'll move on to item number 3, which is approval of the February 6, 2023 minutes. I'd entertain a motion to approve those minutes. All right, thank you.
So moved. Second.
Second. Any comments, corrections? Anybody sees?
Ain't nobody out this. No one's at the meeting.
Well, there's a couple of us here, but are there any comments or questions on the minutes?
Okay, I'm gonna tell you.
Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Abstentions? Minutes are approved. All right, we'll move right on to item number 4, which is a presentation of municipal affordable housing plans. And with us in the room, we have Timothy Hollister, who I think is going to present on behalf of the group. And I had a chance to quickly scan the report. I read it a little bit more closely today, and I just want to say I'm really grateful for the work and effort that went into this report. No matter how much you think you know about affordable housing, the more you read about it, the more you learn. So I'm really grateful that the committee did the due diligence that they did to put this report together, and looking forward to the presentation on it. Turn on your mic. Yeah. There you go.
Thank you, Representative Rojas, Mr. Heft, Commissioner Pickering, other commission members. Thank you and good afternoon. I am a land use and environmental attorney with the firm of Hinckley, Allen and Snyder in Hartford. For most of my 41 years of practice, I have been involved in one way or another with affordable housing, and I have worked with both municipalities and property owners. For the past year, it has been my privilege to work as co-chair with State Representative Roland Lamar to chair the Affordable Housing Plans Working Group. And in fact, Representative Lamar and I arm wrestled as to who would do this presentation. And as you can see, I lost. Just kidding. I'm pleased to present our group's report today. And I would ask listeners to bear in mind, I am presenting the report of the group, not speaking for myself. Our report was adopted by consensus on February 16th, distributed last week online with the agenda. And there are, for anybody in the room, there are some hard copies over at the clerk's desk. The working group's task, as assigned by Public Act 21-29, has been to make recommendations about the affordable housing plans that are now required at least every 5 years by General Statutes 830J, with specific attention to 3 areas. 1, housing opportunities, including multifamily for all residents of the municipality and the planning region. Coordinating affordable housing with the needs identified in the state's consolidated plan, which will be the subject of this meeting next month. And finally, how compliance should be demonstrated. It's important to recognize at the outset that our charge was not to address 830G. Our focus was and is the Zoning Enabling Act, General Statutes Section 8-2, which governs zoning authority obligations and prohibitions for all 169 Connecticut municipalities. As you can see from our working group roster, we're blessed to have a wide range of constituencies, perspectives, and expertise, including the Conference of Municipalities, the Council of Small Towns, several cities and towns, land use planners, Office of Policy and Management, real estate finance, housing advocates, housing program administrators, and demographic experts. And I really want to thank and commend the working group. As you'll hear, we had several highly debated issues, but I think everyone would agree that our process was thoughtful, collaborative, candid, and supportive. I just have no hesitation in saying it was one of the highlights of my working career to work with this group. And of course, one of the other ironies is in the pandemic and the post-pandemic, we never met in person, but Zoom brought us together. So let me turn now to the report itself, starting with what I'll call the background and the context, sections 1 and 2. We started by considering what I will call the hand that we have been dealt, which is the structure of land use regulation in Connecticut. And I know a lot of people on the commission know a lot about this, but some people don't. So I want to spend a minute or two just on this background. Most major governmental functions in our small state are administered at the state level by one state agency with one set of rules and regulations, one staff. For example, transportation, environmental protection, public utilities, public health, telecommunications, energy, corrections, and others, but not land use. Land use is where the state, even though we are not a home rule state, has delegated broad powers in Section 8-2, the Zoning Enabling Act, to each of our 169 municipalities. It is well documented that the state's original delegation of this zoning authority, which began in the 1920s as part of a nationwide movement, was intended to maintain and enforce at that time racial and economic segregation. In the past 100 years, the only truly significant limits on local zoning power have been the anti-discrimination laws, such as the federal and state Fair Housing Acts. And meanwhile, generally speaking, judges are instructed to defer to local discretion about land use. As a result, the central issue in land use law and policy in Connecticut for zoning in general, but in affordable housing in particular, has been, should the state legislature take back some of its delegated authority and discretion because municipal land use commissions are perceived as not responding to local, regional, and statewide housing needs? That has been the question. And I would note that around the nation right now, as anybody will see from the newspapers, there are several other states that are having exactly this same discussion. So in Connecticut, in the past 35 years, the principal efforts to rebalance the state delegation to municipalities have been 830G in 1989, the 1991 amendments to the Zoning Enabling Act, which introduced the idea of regulations promoting economic and racial diversity and choice in housing and multifamily housing. The year 2000 amendments to 830G, which everybody forgets about, but were meant to make the statute more responsive to local concerns. The 2007 incentive housing program, which was intended to be, if you will, a bottom-up program, but which was based on a slate of economic incentives from the state level, which never materialized because of the recession of 2008. The next effort was the 2017 requirement that towns prepare periodic affordable housing plans. And then most recently, Public Act 2129, which brought us here as this commission and made several substantial changes to the housing provisions of the Zoning Enabling Act and mandated affordable housing reports to be filed by June of 22. Now, as an important aside, and again, this is something I've mentioned to this commission, but for other listeners, I'll just go over it very briefly, what we've called the timing problem. For our working group, the 2021 direction to towns to file their plans by June of 2022, and our assignment to produce a guidance document for those plans during 2022 overlapped. So while we were conducting our work and preparing our guidance, the towns were preparing and filing their plans. So we decided ultimately to use this to our advantage, to use the reports as a real-time laboratory for what the towns were doing well and where they could use additional guidance. So our report has been shaped by this legislative history and context, our specific assigned task, and our review of the 2021-22 municipal plans. I would note that the list of the plans that we reviewed as of November 2022, 110 of them, is in Appendix A to the report. And in a footnote on that page, you'll find a link to the OPM website and the Southeast Council, the Connecticut chapter of the American Planning Association websites, where you will find links to the individual plans. We also want to acknowledge the main past guidance document, which was the 2020 guide prepared by the Department of Housing and the Regional Plan Association. We would point out that our report is different mainly in that in 2021, as I said, the General Assembly altered state law. So our report is the first one to explain what towns need to do now to comply with those 2021 amendments. And then, of course, we had the benefit of reviewing the plans of the past 18 months. We had a number of important points of consensus and recognition of challenges. The points of consensus were towns have a significant role in whether, where, and how housing gets built. Connecticut is a highly segregated state, both racially and economically. Municipal regulations and plans can mitigate that segregation. Connecticut needs tens of thousands more lower cost housing units. New and rehabilitated housing must be balanced with the existing built environments and with environmental protection in all its forms. We are a state of urban, suburban, and rural areas. And for all of these reasons, and this was the most important point, we came to the conclusion, the consensus, that one size does not fit all as far as land use. And our report had to be a menu of choices, and that is what it is. We recognize a couple of limitations. Single-family homes are the predominant land use in our state. Higher density development has impacts. Clean air and clean water must be protected. Infrastructure, sewer, water, roads, utilities cost money. Open space preservation is critical. And climate change, sustainability, green building, renewable energy, and disaster resiliency all need to be part of the planning mix. And the other limitations we noticed specifically as to the 830J plans, we recognize it was an unfunded mandate, that some towns have limited staff and resources. We were not surprised to learn that there was both overt and latent opposition and resistance to the assigned task of preparing the housing plans. And also one reality was that the towns did not have a lot of time to digest and respond to the 2021 changes in state law. So with that background, let me turn to section 4 of our report, which is our review of the 830J municipal plans. Our findings were, in summary, most of the plans contained a very good analysis of local housing needs, such as what percentage of households are cost burdened by rent or mortgage costs, and analysis of what types of housing current regulations allow. Several towns between 10 and 20 did a very good job of specifically identifying where lower cost housing can be built and recommending regulation changes that would allow that development. Several cities with the highest percentage of affordable housing provided very thoughtful plans about how to manage and maintain their diversity. We gave a shout out to the town of Suffield, which had in its report a one-page photo mosaic, which is Appendix E to our report, that very nicely illustrates the different types of housing, households that need housing. I commend that to your attention. However, despite this good news, reviewing 120 plus plans, a list of things emerged that need improvement. Quite a few towns spent several pages explaining why they do not need or cannot accommodate planning for affordable housing. Several set pretty minuscule goals on the order of 5 to 10 units over the next 5 years in towns with thousands of existing units. Several suggested in words or substance that our cities have ample affordable housing and we should not be picking on suburbs or rural areas. Almost none of the plans, and this may be a function of the timing, but almost none of the plans, even those written in 2022, recognize the Zoning Enabling Act as amended in 2021 as part of their current obligation to comply with state law. However, and this is right in the report, the biggest concern, a characteristic of a clear majority of the plans is the absence of specific actions, locations, and timeframes for producing more housing. And I will just give you the impression that this majority of the reports led us to believe that after assessing the housing need, the drafters looked at specific regulation changes or zone changes for specific locations and said, that's the untouchable third rail. We're not willing to go there. And they stopped short of doing so. So with due respect to those who labored over the plans, of which there are many, it is a fair conclusion that the 2021-22 mandate was an opportunity for towns who have argued for keeping local control over regulation that governs housing to show what they could do. But the result was relatively few towns prepared specific plans to increase housing production. We invite you to read the reports. It took me about 2 weeks. And we did read them. And I'll note that in our working group, we had a lengthy debate about how to deliver this part of the message. The concern, of course, was that being too critical would not spur the towns to do better, versus the counter message was that the towns needed a figurative kick in the pants and a message to do better. So I will just conclude this portion by saying that section 4 of our report is intended to state the facts, but deliver a message of concern about the plans that were filed last year. Section 5 of our report is creating a local plan. I will say we did not have any real epiphanies here, but we compiled the best practices as provided to us and focused basically on 3 main points. One is a solid housing needs assessment, absolutely essential. Public education about what affordable housing is, why it's important, and what a housing plan should contain, maybe dispel some myths, and then focusing on what actions will lead to creating actual housing units, identifying barriers that exclude lower income housing, and recommending specific steps to eliminate those barriers, identifying specific locations, enabling higher density, and assigning clear responsibility and deadlines for taking those steps. So now if we could go to the PowerPoint slides. So section 6 of our report is the requirement to comply with state law. And this is the what I will call the low-hanging fruit. Every town, and you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Every town today has a legal obligation to comply with the requirements of General Statutes 8-2 as amended in 2021. These requirements include town regulations cannot ban expressly or in effect multifamily, meaning more than 4 units. There are about 20 or so towns that still do that. They must eliminate minimum floor area regulations that exceed the building or the housing codes. The minimum there is about 320 square feet. There's several towns that still specify more than 1,000 square feet minimum for a single family home or dwelling unit. They must eliminate excessive parking requirements. Even though there is an opt-out procedure, a town should have a solid reason for opting out. Let me just pause for a minute there and say, if you think about it, just on any given parcel, the combination of eliminating excessive minimum floor area and eliminating excessive parking requirements, just those 2 changes would have the potential to open up residential densities quite significantly. Next slide, please. Towns need to adopt and implement statewide standards for alternative dwelling units, noting that there is, again, an opt-out procedure for that. Eliminate numerical or percentage caps on multifamily units. Eliminate regulations that use preserving the character of the town, quote unquote, as a zoning criterion. Eliminate excessive application fees. Next slide, please. And then there is the 10% rule. And I'm just going to spend a minute on this because this is probably the most misunderstood portion of our affordable housing system. Everyone needs to understand that achieving 10% of a town's housing stock on the Department of Housing's 830G 10% list provides the town with an exemption from 830G, but it does not mean that the town has met a state of Connecticut goal, standard, quota, or policy for affordable housing. The DOH 10% list is an annual count of government-assisted and deed-restricted units. The list is not an evaluation of whether the town has satisfied housing need or a metric to determine need. And one way to understand this very important point is to consider that affordable housing, generally speaking, serves those at earning 80% or less of the median income. Roughly speaking, that's 40% of the population. So achieving 10% on the Department of Housing list does not mean that a town has satisfied local or regional need. And we should all understand the state has not set 10% affordable housing as the goal to serve 40% of the population. So again, respectfully, those 830G plans that set as their goal to reach the state's 10% quota, a phrase that is used in quite a few of them, or similar words, reflects a misunderstanding and should be revised at some point. Next slide, please. The second part of complying with the existing state law is more subtle and more difficult. Each town should review its regulations and identify those that have the effect of excluding multifamily housing, such as through owner's conditions or procedural requirements. Regulations that prevent or inhibit diversity and choice in housing. Regulations that maintain or promote racial or economic segregation. Regulations that are contrary to what are called the affirmatively furthering, quote unquote, purposes of the Federal Fair Housing Act, which is now part of 8-2. Regulations that do not serve a legitimate purpose of zoning and exist primarily or exclusively to make housing more expensive. Another way to state that is to understand that what we're looking for in the regulations is to ask of each regulation, does it increase the cost of housing? And if so, what is its regulatory purpose? Next slide, please. Which leads us now to section 7 of our report, which is the menu. And there's a lot here, so I'm going to go through these rather quickly and not stop to give examples, but we can certainly circle back there. So increase density. Review the definition of buildable land, where housing can be built. Review the balance of single family versus middle housing versus multifamily. Consider where housing can be rehabilitated if not newly constructed. Don't limit your potential builders to government or nonprofit. Allow profit, for-profit, and government each to sponsor development, either jointly or individually. Next slide, please. Specifically plan for the most needed unit types. Units for people with disabilities, units for households below 30 to 40% of the median income, and units with 3 or 4 bedrooms. Review your design standards for necessity and added cost. Review the regulations for actual buildability and practicality. And I'll give one example. There are some regulations that have a very short permit expiration requirement, which probably violates state law, but that can undermine what you think you're doing with the regulation. Identify and eliminate unnecessary procedural requirements. Next slide, please. Review your non-residential zones. Which ones could accommodate mixed use and greater housing? Specifically plan for middle housing, 2, 3, and 4 unit structures, which often can be developed without public sewer. Promote transit-oriented development, which has been a hot topic in this building. Next slide, please. Consider financial steps. This was a terrific discussion within our group. Make sure that your residents know that there are lower cost mortgage sources such as CHFA and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Think about targeted property tax relief. Confirm the availability to your residents of rental assistance vouchers and certificates. Establish an affordable housing fund. Look at donating or selling municipally owned land. Make payments that would buy down the cost of existing units, and make information about rental opportunities accessible to all of your residents. Next slide, please. Consider what steps have immediate impacts, such as the financial steps, versus longer term impacts like regulation changes. Inclusionary zoning is a complicated topic. We've included it in the report because it does work in some places, but not all. So we ask you to proceed with caution, noting that such systems can be difficult to set up or administer. Consider relief from strict non-conforming use rules. Understand the saying that zoning is not a promise, Existing property owners are not entitled legally to freeze existing zoning or to even have an expectation that it is frozen in time. Next slide, please. Recognize that residency preferences are generally illegal because they maintain segregation. In addition to looking at your zoning regulations, look at your subdivision regulations, your wetlands regulations, and your sewer plans and regulations for what can be revised to, especially to promote greater infrastructure. Make your local plan of conservation and development consistent with your adopted 830J plan. Interesting note, CHFA now, when it grants low-income housing tax credits, the federal program awards points for developments that are consistent with your 830J plan. Conduct what's called value engineering to lower development and construction costs. And finally, something that is spotlighted in the appendix to our report, conduct what we call a grid exercise. Compile a chart of your existing regulations and what uses they allow. And that in and of itself will show you where the gaps are and where the opportunities are. And finally, for legislative recommendations, last slide, please. We have recommended that this commission consider setting up a timetable for response to and implementation of this report. There was a call for specifying who adopts an affordable housing plan under 830J, sort of a point of confusion in some towns. Consider where this report's recommendations can be enacted as 8-2 requirements. Consider requiring updated 830J plans to review their content against our report, and then ask the Department of Housing to propose and publish additional models for affordability plans, the actual documents that govern income restrictions and administration, things like utility costs, mortgage rates for sale units, and so forth. So that is our report, and I hope you will find it useful. And in conclusion, I'm going to take a moment and just take my co-chair hat off and speak as someone who has been doing this for 40 years, just give you my own impression. Although 830G could be improved, we could, for example, move more toward the Massachusetts one-stop model. Working on this report and with this working group showed me that our best approach, which was sort of led into by the 2021 amendments, is to further amend the Zoning Enabling Act to curb the exclusionary practices that don't serve any legitimate purpose of zoning. They are any regulation in any town, we will find some of those rules. In other words, we need more specific state direction. And before the proponents of local control get crazy, I'm not talking about in the sense of taking away local planning and zoning initiative, but preventing the overt and more subtle exclusionary practices that have crept into our regulations unchecked during the past 50 to 60 years. Put another way, the issue, in my view, is using the power of government, the power of zoning, the police power, to exclude people whose income is below the median. We would do better, and we should be able to prune the excesses without inhibiting local planning. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
No, thank you. That was
That's a good day's work.
a well synthesized 40-page report down into a reasonable presentation that you were able to give us. And I don't know if certainly we'll open it up to questions from members of the commission, but if we could go back to the list of recommendations you had, can you put that one slide up? If you could just expand, I know you listed 4, but there are many more in the report. Could you just expand upon them a little bit about, you made one about, there was some confusion about who is the approving authority. Is it some communities were confused whether it's a legislative body versus the Planning and Zoning Commission, or you could just expand on those recommendations?
Okay, well, do you mean the legislative recommendation?
Yes,
I'm
yeah.
sorry. I thought you don't mean the menu. Okay. No, I think our report, the challenge was, we wrote a 40-page report. We could have written a 400-page report by giving examples and proposed bills and things of that nature. But what we decided to do was give a menu to touch on the topics, and then the legislative recommendations, I think their highest and best use, if I can use the lawyer phrase, would be to come up with a more detailed list that town planners and town officials and affordable housing committees going forward can take and to use, put their regulations in the right hand and put our list of menu in their left hand and see how they compare, see where the gaps are, see where the opportunities are. And as I said at the end, identify those places where there are exclusions that you have the effect of excluding, but really don't serve any purpose of legitimate land use. That's what we're trying to do. And so each of the legislative recommendations is one piece of that process. I guess that's the best way.
So and I remember the guidance, the original 8-30 J guidance was like, just come up with a plan, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And we understand, we acknowledge that.
Yeah. And that was 2017. So towns had 5 years to put these plans together.
Well, the 2021 Public Act 21-29 was the one that said accelerated the schedule
Got it.
and said as of October of 2021, 5-year plans by June of 22.
Okay.
And a lot of towns had already done that under the 2017 legislation, but most of them had not. So there were 80 or 90 plans filed just in the first 6 months of 2022, which was a Herculean effort. There's no doubt that a lot of people worked very hard, but you're right, they did not have a lot of guidance as to what to do. And this report is intended to fill that in.
And in terms of your first recommendation with the timetable for response, you're talking about giving prescriptive guidance to towns about how you're presenting a timeline for how they're going to implement their plan.
Yes, and I'll bring up those representatives of the towns who were on our commission who were not thrilled about us making a recommendation of that time. We just got done. We don't want to get back into the soup right away. But as I said, a lot of our recommendations are things that should have happened in 2022 in response to the 2021 legislation. So what I call the low-hanging fruit. I don't see why we should wait to the next 5-year cycle of municipal plans to ask for compliance with state law that was passed 2 years ago.
And this is probably a question for OPM and Mr. Heft to my right here. But was there any discussion about staggering the submission of the plan so that they're not all due at the same time in 1 year? I don't know, going forward. That makes sense to do, to have towns kind of, 1 year it's 20 towns, the next year it's another 20 towns. I don't know if there's any value in that, but that was one of the concerns that I'd heard, that they're all due at once.
Speaking as a land use lawyer, I'm not sure I could agree that we allow towns to stagger compliance with existing state law. That they should be doing that now. And I'm not sure what the rationale would be to say, other than people who have to read the reports and don't want to read 100 in 1 year like I did. But they, staggering, every town is working independently. So why not have them all put their nose to the grindstone and do the hard work of being specific and complying with state law now? It's an unfunded mandate, but I think that's, if we want to move the ball forward, as I said, what I was saying in an indirect way at the end there was, there's a lot to be gained by standardizing more what we require of the towns. And again, I'm not advocating that we take away local control. I'm advocating that we take away the right to do things that don't have any land use value and just drive up the cost of housing.
And I don't disagree with the principle that towns should be doing what they're already supposed to be doing legally.
Right.
I was more concerned about the OPM's capacity. If we want the state to be able to respond
Right.
in a constructive way to all of these plans, does OPM have the capacity to respond to 169 versus 21 year, 20 the next, 20 the next? I guess that was what I was asking.
Just thinking out loud, you could require everybody to come into compliance by X date, and then OPM would, when its resources allow, could review those, but that doesn't have to happen immediately. Speaking for OPM.
So one is under actually current law, there's no provision for OPM to review all of the affordable housing plans. So,
Right.
It's basically just a submission at this point. There is a provision that if a municipality ties their affordable housing plan into their POCD and submits that way, that's going to change the cycle, because those are done every 10 years and, depending upon how they do that way. But looking at the plan of conservation development model, they're all not due the same year, because it depends how those were all originally set up and adopted, and then they have to be revised every 10 years. So if there's going to be a revision, provision within the affordable housing, on that, could a schedule be sent up as we do like a revaluation schedule, to your point, Representative, looking at, moving this forward once everyone has those initial plans, maybe then it becomes an update plan has to be done and you set up a staggering cycle or something, especially if there's going to be a fuller review process within that.
And if I anticipate what's probably your next question is, our report really needs to be coordinated with what you're going to hear next month on the consolidated plan and also the sewage working group. Maybe not so much the model code, but there's a coordination process among those three areas that we need to coordinate those, and then we need to figure out what the timetable is for that coordination.
And then part of my asking is, trying to figure out where's the accountability? I mean, a plan's great. It's submitted and then it's just submitted. I think getting to a point of accountability is where I asked a question about capacity at OPM, and maybe accountability is the appropriate place for that isn't with OPM. But if it isn't, I don't know where it is other than the courts, right? And we have a lawsuit. So that was part of the question is, we now operate a model. I mean, it's why 60 years after the Fair Housing Act, we are where we are, based on a lot of what's encompassed in the report and a lot of the acknowledgements that took place from members of a group that came to consensus, and members of those groups are often at odds about what we should be doing on this. So I appreciate that there was at least consensus arrived at to present this, but it's also an acknowledgement that there are lots of towns and cities that aren't doing what they're doing, and the state is somewhat complicit in that, allowing that to happen,
Right.
Because of the lack of political will that we have to actually do something stronger. Again, not to punish towns, not to remove local control, because I don't favor that either, but to actually arrive at trying to move us in a direction of actually doing something, because it seems that everybody acknowledges we have a housing problem, we have an affordable housing problem, we all care about affordable housing, we care about our constituents and their ability to live affordably somewhere, yet we continue to do nothing about it. And that, I guess that was the premise of my question there. So.
Yes, thank you. You may or may not be aware that the Council of Governments for decades have had a responsibility under state law to review proposed land use changes to subdivision ordinances, zoning regulations, and zoning maps. And that process really looks at impacts on neighboring jurisdictions. It's triggered with it when a proposed change could impact land within 500 feet of municipal border. That process, I think, is of dubious value. We get land use referrals from a town saying person XYZ would like to add a one-room addition onto their home. Is that in conflict or not in conflict with the regional plan of conservation development? We do not get a land use referral when a major traffic generator, such as a new shopping mall, opens, because that is not of regional significance, because it's not within 500 feet of municipal boundary. We also do not get referrals for the death by 1,000 cuts types of changes, right? Where it's a very small change, but it can have a very large cumulative impact, and it could affect the rest of the region. And so, not to say this is to say the state should not exercise some oversight and towns shouldn't be responsible for themselves, but perhaps there's an opportunity to revisit the land use referral process and change that statute. So we focus on the things that really do matter. New York's a great example of this. Our statute is based off New York statute. Several years ago, they realized it wasn't working. And now the counties, municipalities negotiate what the land use referrals are about. It's about major developments and zoning text changes that have a regional impact and not adding an addition onto one house. On a separate note, if I may, I think in our experience, and we worked with our communities in Westcog on these plans, some of the challenges we faced were with Connecticut being a state where nobody wants to go first. Everybody looks around and says, who's done this first, right? We don't want to be caught with our pants down or make a mistake. And the guidance for 8-30J came out very late, and it was not nearly as comprehensive as this excellent presentation you've given. We know that zoning is and can be a cost driver for housing, but so is the building code, electrical code, plumbing code, fire and safety, road design, lending costs, labor availability and cost, materials, all of these factors. Some are within municipal authority, such as infrastructure standards on local roads. Unfortunately, 8-30J didn't address that. And the way it was written, the language they used, affordable housing developments, implicitly refers back to 8-30G. So I'm concerned a number of municipalities read this and said, okay, what does this language mean exactly? And they thought just about 8-30G, which pertains to zoning. And they didn't think about the greater universe of how they and actors at multiple levels can help to rein in housing costs. So, if we are talking about amending the statute, it would be really great if it could spell out the other things to be looked at and potentially what other parties should be brought in. Make it not just the purview of planning and zoning.
Very well said. I agree with everything you said. Terrific.
Ms. Lamar.
Hi, thanks so much, Tim. That was a great report, and the written report, which I scanned this morning, was extraordinarily thorough, and kudos to your committee for getting so much done. A couple comments, I guess, more in the vein of comments than questions. One, I think you were kind in your assessment of the reports. I think that many folks who were around in 2017 will recall that the sort of legislative history here is that 830J was inserted into the statute in an effort by suburban legislators to prove that their towns could handle affordable housing on their own. The pitch was, stop bullying us with 830G, we can do this on our own, give us a chance to show you. And then 830J was adopted as a result of that. And the idea was, town by town, these towns would come forward and just show us how awesome they could be in terms of affordable housing production. And so some of the criticism, like the comment that was just leveled, why does 830J make reference to 830G? Well, it's not because affordable housing policy is all about 830G. It's because the folks who drafted 830J only cared about 830G. They just cared about not having to accommodate multifamily and affordable housing development in their towns. So they drafted it that way for that reason. And I didn't read nearly as many of the reports as you and your committee members did, but I read some of the ones that came out of the COG in which I live, here in the SCROG in the New Haven area. I read some of the West COG ones as well. And to me, the biggest lesson drawn was that if 830J was intended to prove that towns could handle this on their own, the plans that were submitted proved that they could not. Most of the towns in my COG submitted pretty much identical reports. And as you suggested, they have town-specific data around need, but then the recommendations, notwithstanding all of the, one size fits all doesn't work. Every single recommendation section of every single 830J plan in the COG in which I live was identical, like literally word for word identical. And it's because they all use the same consultant. The city of New Haven, because we care about affordable housing, did not end up submitting the report that was drafted for us by the COG, and instead submitted a report that a local affordable housing commission here in New Haven had done some years before, not intended to comply with the 830J requirement, simply an affordable housing commission that we formed because we're not assholes. I don't know how anybody could draw a conclusion here other than this doesn't work. And I deeply appreciate the 75 pages that you've put together of here's what you all ought to do better next time. But I also think that we ought to take seriously what it was that we were told by legislators back in 2017, which is, let us show you that we can do it. And them having now proven that they can't. The response here isn't simply to make 830J better. It's also got to be, you said you could do this, you clearly can't. You outsourced this to consultants who, wrote one size fits all plans. In fact, you don't have the in-house capacity to do it. You barely understood some of the terminology that was here. Maybe maybe we can't rely on you all to figure this out. And as a commission, we, again, just ought to take them seriously. They said, let us show you that we can do it. And then they showed us that they can't. So aren't there next steps other than clarifying the next homework assignment for them? Thanks.
Okay, so your question at the end is what can we do besides just clarifying what should be in the reports? I think my answer is what I was saying to Representative Rojas, which is the timetable. If we could set a timetable just to comply with state law and go through this pruning exercise, if you want to call it that, and that were to be done in the next, say, 12 to 18 months, I think that would be a tremendous step forward. And that doesn't require anything new to be, because we know what the requirements are and the existing regulations in each town are what they are. And we could go through that.
Yeah, can I just quickly respond? So I 100% agree with the timetable. I think there's just a broader conversation to be had here. You know, Connecticut has the highest number of land use lawyers per capita in the country. And the reason is because we've created a cottage industry around an extraordinarily complicated zoning system with hyperlocal control. And we've already become a full employment state for land use lawyers. And Tim, you and I might be appreciative of that, but most people think it's a waste. And I would just hate to see us become a full employment state for consultants and planners as well. Around in my part of the state, we didn't even hire consultants who were local. I think they were out of Massachusetts, right? So I would urge us not to go down this road of, you know, creating requirements for the sake of requirements. I completely agree with the timetable. I think that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. But I think there's more we can do as well, so that we're not simply creating work for lawyers and planners and consultants, but we're creating opportunities for affordable housing units and tenants and homeowners. Thanks.
No, thank you. Representative Scott.
Thank you, Chairman Rojas. I have a quick question on some of the testimony that was just given. It was right at the beginning of the testimony, and I had a question about some of the numbers. There was a number, I believe you mentioned, that you said 10,000 or 10,000s of affordable housing units that are needed. Can I get a clarity on that? I'm sorry, it was towards the beginning of your testimony. I just didn't write it down properly or hear it properly.
Well, Representative, there have been various estimates done by both housing advocacy organizations and I think even by some of the state government agencies. I've heard the number 86,000 thrown out as how many lower cost units we need. I've seen 138,000 and other estimates. So that I just said tens of thousands to stay away from picking a number in the range and asking me having people ask me to justify the exact number. But that's the range that's been tossed around for a couple of years now as to what we need statewide.
Okay, I appreciate that. You know, from my standpoint, that seems really, really high. But again, I'll have to look at the reports and see how they come up to those numbers, knowing that, you know, we have 3,000 people homeless, which is 3,000 too many, right? 3,000 too many people homeless. And I know there are people in different facilities that are not necessarily in their own rental places. But I think it's something that we should definitely look at and understand those numbers and make sure they're more realistic. You know, our population went up less than 1% over a 10-year census period. So just want to make sure we're, again, just being realistic with any numbers we're throwing out there and what realistically is needed. So I appreciate that. I just want to get clarity. So I appreciate you kind of generalizing, because I do agree there's a wide range of those numbers, and want to make sure we're in the right range. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Representative Scott, just for additional context, I mean, you know, you cited the 3,000 homeless, right? That is the extreme kind of outcome of the crisis that we faced in housing. There are probably thousands more who are on the cusp of homelessness. And then there are those who are just severely cost burdened and can barely afford to do anything else but pay for their housing. I think when you add up those three groups, you probably arrive at tens of thousands of units of housing that are needed. And then include on top of that a number of families throughout Connecticut who are living in really, really unsafe, unsanitary conditions as well too. There is a lot of housing in the state of Connecticut that needs to be taken down and replaced. I think when you add all those numbers together, you arrive, you can easily come to a conclusion that tens of thousands of units of new housing are needed to meet the demands that are very large.
And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said the cost burden, which I think is the predominant category of the estimates that have been done by the Open Communities Alliance and other groups. It starts with who is cost burden, meaning they pay more than 30% of their household income for housing.
So we need less expensive housing, not necessarily additional units of housing. I mean, we do maybe need some units of additional units of housing, or as you know, Chairman Rojas said, you refurbishing the ones we currently have, but not necessarily brand new units of housing.
I think as Representative Rojas said, it's a mix.
Okay.
Yeah, it's probably a combination of those.
Right.
There's a lot of old housing. You look at the state housing portfolio, a lot of that housing needs to be replaced. Right. Housing throughout the city of Hartford, a lot of it built in the late 1800s, early 1900s that are just past their useful life in need of reinvestment. But also, looking at it from a kind of economics 101, if we want to get at cost, we probably need to increase supply as well too, to try to drive down that price, that cost.
That makes sense.
Thank you.
Ms. Lamar, is your hand back up?
Yeah, I would, that was very comprehensive answer from both Representative Rojas and Attorney Hollister. So I originally put my hand up to answer Representative Scott's question, but one thing you did everything I would have said, minus one thing. There's oftentimes a suggestion that because Connecticut's population hasn't gone up by double digits in recent years, that means that we don't need more housing. And exactly the opposite is true. We don't attract new population because our housing is incredibly unaffordable. And that's why the prices have gone up so much. So how do we know people want to live here? Because people are willing to pay quite a lot to live here. Basic economics 101. Increased supply will help bring down prices, but the fact that we haven't added supply means that we have artificially capped people's ability to express their demand. And the way the demand gets expressed is through extraordinarily high and inflated increasing property values and rents. We know people want to live here because the prices are high. It's not the causation that people suggest is simply wrong. Thanks.
Mr. Hollister, a question I had on the needs assessment piece of it. Are we suggesting that towns need to conduct their own needs assessment as well?
And they did, and that's what they did best. It's looking at their own housing stock and perhaps counting their own cost burdened and homeless, other underhoused, poorly housed people. Those portions of the reports were generally terrific. So, that's an important part of every affordable housing plan, is to know what your need is.
And then did those reports actually lay out kind of a number of units
Oh, yeah.
that they thought they needed?
Census data, household income, very, very good sections. They know what the needs are. I said it was when they got to some of the specific solutions that seemed like the electric fence went up. So.
Got it. Thank you. Are there, Mr. Winograd?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to compliment the committee on what was really a great report. In particular, the slide referring to the 10% rule as not being a goal, I think is a really valuable piece of information to put out to people. I did catch Rafi Podolsky's testimony the other day at the hearing. I did not watch the whole thing. Ms. Lamar, I appreciate your blogging tweets about that, because it was not something that I could follow for the 24 hours. But I thought Rafi made that point really well, and it does come up as, we'll put in when in West Hartford we approve a market rate housing. We'll occasionally get the comment that that's actually making things worse by making the percentage now a harder goal. Whereas in fact, obviously we're adding housing, which helps supply and demand, and even if it's market rate, it has an advantage of creating more vacancies and therefore hopefully driving down the price, which has been out of control. So I do think it's more than just a rhetorical thing. I do think that is really damaging, frankly, that 10% being used as some kind of goal. That if you hit 10%, you win and you're done, is certainly not true. And on the flip side, I think towns that are far from it act as if there's no reason to do anything because they're never going to get to the goal. And I think the broader point we should be making is housing is good, and let's build more of it. And the 10% and all these rules are designed to kind of get there, but not to forget about that broader purpose.
No, thank you for that. Any other questions from members on the Zoom or in the room? Ms. Pickering.
Yes, thank you. Did any of the municipalities, obviously you have a very comprehensive understanding of these affordable housing plans, did any of them speak to, I think the point Representative Scott was making about the cost gap for people who are housing burdened but already have housing and ways to reduce that in existing housing? And also, did any of them demonstrate an awareness of the constraints of municipal action and the factors that are beyond their control that are also needed to help bring down housing costs?
As to your second part, yes, I think that was recognized. And in terms of recognizing the cost burden, I would say, I'm not sure I could give you a good number among 120, how many did it, but as I was saying before to Representative Rojas, really the best part of each of the housing plans was the housing needs assessment, because, and even you did it in the Westcog report, that the data in that report are terrific. And the need was very well documented from a lot of different perspectives. So yes, I think we have a good handle on that part of the problem.
Thank you for that. And I would like to point out that in our regional toolkit, that was only the first step in a
Right.
process. We are now doing a regional affordable housing financing study because the municipalities came to us and said, we understand the scale of the problem. We don't understand how to solve it, because a lot of this is very complex and we've not been developers and we haven't looked at our road design standards in 30 or 40 years. It's very complex. It's 101% solutions. And so I think it was a good start, but there's more to be done.
Thank you. Any other questions from members of the commission or in the room? Tina, thank you. That was an excellent presentation, and we all know that there's a lot more work to be done.
Thank you.
You just reminded us of that over and over again, so. All right, moving on to the next part of our agenda, section 5. Do I have the right agenda? Yes. Now I do. Some conversation around House Bill 6647, an act concerning the state plan of conservation and development. I'll turn it over to Mr. Hepp.
Sure. Thank you, Representative. So just a quick update on 6647, which were the recommendations from this commission through the state municipal statutory plan process. Planning and Development did have their public hearing on February 15th on this bill. Most of the testimony was in support. You can call it up on the Connecticut General Assembly website. So we're waiting action on the bill at this point, but public hearing has been done on it. So that's the update.
Well, thank you. Any questions, Mr. Heft, on that? Seeing none. Under business is a continued, the timeline is presented for us to continue our work. Next commission meeting is April 3rd. Well, we'll hear about the state consolidated plan. Other, do you want me to come to you now under other? No, okay.
Anyone else?
No, I don't. Right. Going on to section 6, public comment. Is there anybody from the public, either on Zoom or here present in the room, who wanted to offer a comment? Just people smiling at each other, which means I think a no. And there's no one on the Zoom either, right? No. All right. And with that, I think that completes our meeting for the day in 1 hour and 1 minute. Thank you, everybody, for participating. And again, to all the members of this particular work group for their work in putting this plan together, this report together. Thank you, and we are adjourned.